So for those of you who have not worked with watercolor very much, I have here my travel watercolor set by Koi, and it's got all these different colors in it. It's got two mixing trays, one that is detachable that stores inside the box, and then the inside of the lid is also a mixing surface, which is really nice. You can take it out in the field with you and paint with it. It's really a good size. You can find one that has fewer colors, or you can work with this one. Even if you have a watercolor set that only has 6 colors, you're totally fine using a small set. This is a color chart that I have made just on a piece of watercolor paper, and I keep it inside this set, inside the lid. What that does is it allows me to have a reference for what color all of these paints are when mixed with water and painted on white paper, because it's hard to tell sometimes what the difference between 147 and 149 are in the pans, because they look very similar, these two blues. But if you look over here, 147 and 149 are actually quite different. Same with these greens. When you look at them in the paint box, they're very, very similar, but then when you look at them on the paper, once you paint them with water, they're quite different. So I want you all on one page in your sketchbook to make a color chart and write the names of the colors down. They should be noted on your watercolor box. This particular, the Koi set, uses numbers. So I've numbered the colors on my chart so I know what I'm looking at. And I just pull that out when I'm out working. Now these are the pure colors. They've not been mixed. We'll talk about mixing in just a few minutes. So that's the first thing I want you to do. And so I'll show you how that's going to work for those of you who have not used watercolor very often. So I'm just going to do another set of some of these colors in here. So I've got a cup of clean water, and I use a small cup of water, and I will change it frequently when the water gets dirty. So I'm going to get water on my brush, and then I'm going to start with number 145, which is this color right here. So I'm going to take, this is dry right now, I'm going to take a fully loaded brush, loaded with water, and put my water bucket up here so you can see it. Okay, so I'm going to take a fully loaded brush with water, and I'm just going to drop that water onto the top of the watercolor. I'll come back and get a little more water. So what happens, these dry cakes of watercolor, when you put water on them, it reactivates the paint. So it's just dried watercolor, basically. So you can see I can make a puddle of color. And one of the difficult things with watercolor is to get used to trying to make as intense a color as you can. So what happens a lot of times is if you go in there with a lot of water on your brush and you wet that watercolor pan, what happens is you get kind of a weak mixture, right? So that's pretty weak. You can see that it's much lighter in color than this one, and it's kind of uneven when I move my brush through it. So what I want is I want a pile, a little puddle that's pretty dark, right? So then I'm going to wipe my brush on the edge of my mixing tray, and then I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to make a little mark. So that's still pretty light. It's much lighter than the first one I started with. So I'm going to go back to my pan, and I have less water on my brush now, but the paint in the pan is starting to get more activated. So then I can come back and add a little more to that and make it nice and dark and nice and intense on my color chart. Now to get the lighter value of the same color, I'm just going to I'm going to come over here to my weaker mixture and get a little more water on my brush and make that lighter mark. So with watercolor, to get more intense, you want less water, more pigment. To get lighter or less intense, you want more water and less pigment. The danger or the trouble that people have a lot of times when they're just beginning with watercolor is they don't get that color dark enough. They don't get it intense enough, and so the whole watercolor painting gets really kind of weak. So I want you to make a color chart with one row of dark and one row of light value. If you have to make several boxes in order to get used to making that variety of value, that's totally fine. This color chart is for your use. Okay? So then after you do that, I'm going to set it up here to dry, and I'm going to keep it close by so I can use it for a reference. And then to practice your watercolor skills, I want you to find a simple object to paint. Doesn't have something that doesn't have a ton of color. I've used a tube of paint because it's handy in my studio. I have lots of tubes of paint. All right, so one thing that's very important when you're working with watercolor, try not to leave your brushes in the water. When you leave the brushes in the water, what happens is the bristles get misshapen because they lean against the bottom of the water bucket. So in order to keep those brushes with a good shape, I just have a little rag or a piece of paper towel that I set those brushes on next to my workstation. All right, so now I'm going to look at my drawing that I've done of my paint tube. So I started with just a simple contour drawing of the contour of the paint tube. And I'm not dealing with a ton of detail yet. I want to just lay in the major shapes that I see on the tube of paint itself. And I really, at this point, I'm just going to draw this with straight lines, no real fine detail, okay? Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to draw that shadow. So there are two shadows that I can see, one underneath the front of the paint tube, one underneath the back of the paint tube, because light comes from all different directions. So I'm going to draw the contour, the outline of the shadow on both sides. Again, keeping it fairly simple. And then what I want to do is I want to go back and start to look at some of the detail that I see. So obviously I've got the detail of the shadow on the lid. I'm not going to worry about these little grooves in it yet. I'm looking for major details. So obviously I've got the color stripe here. I've got the word Utrecht and then smaller words in black. But also what I have are some shadows. So I've got a major shadow shape here where it's indented in the bottom of the paint tube. And then I have some shadows on the bottom where it's crinkled and folded over. So I'm going to really just focus on those major shapes. So I've got a shadow on the bottom of the cap. I have the blue stripe. have these black stripes at the bottom. I'm going to worry about the words later. Those black stripes, and then I've got this shadow. So I want to look at the outline shape of that shadow, that indentation here, where you can see the shadow on the tube where it's sort of pushed in. And then I'm going to draw the shapes of the shadows that I see on the bottom of the tube. And I'm going to keep these shapes fairly simple. So really breaking down those shadows to the major shapes. All right, so that's what I'm going to start with. Now, I'm going to think about color. So the surface of the table is sort of a yellowish brown, and it doesn't matter that I'm going to match that color exactly, but what I want is the idea of that color, that kind of yellowish brown color. So I'm going to take a larger brush and I'm going to get some yellow ochre, which is kind of an earthy yellow. I'm going to get a nice sizable puddle of paint. And then to check that the color and the value are what I want, I'm going to go up here on my test sheet. And so where my test sheet is, I keep it handy so that I can try out my colors and see if they're what I want. So I want that to be a little bit more intense, a little bit darker. Okay, now to cover a large area on my page, I'm going to use a big brush and I'm just going to do a wash over most of the page. Okay, so I'm going to start at the edge of my tube with the tip of the brush, and I'm going to swipe the brush back and forth this way, using the side of the brush to cover a lot of territory. Now I'm going to cover the part that's in the light out here, but I'm also going to cover that area that's in shadow, because even though it's in shadow, it is part of that yellowish paper. So I'm going to just come down here, use the side of the brush to make big, wide strokes. I'm going to come up here, add a little bit more paint. So when the paint is wet like this, you can cover a lot of territory. And if you're using a really large brush, that is really helpful. So you can see it kind of puddling here at the edge. I'm going to draw that paint out with my brush so that it doesn't form a puddle in the middle of my painting. Okay, so there I've got a nice yellowish wash on my background. Okay, if I want to even it out on the edges, I can do that, but I'm not going to be too overly concerned at this point. So you can see that the page is really pretty wet right now. It's started to buckle up a little bit. It's really shiny where I can see that it's wet. I want that paint to kind of absorb into the page before I come back into this background area. So I'm going to leave it for a few minutes to dry. before I go back into the background. So I'm going to get a little bit of my blue color. And being very careful not to get my brush into that area of yellow, I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to lay in the color for that stripe. That'll be my base color for that stripe. I'm going to come back and make it darker down here where the shadow is. But right now I just want to get that initial coat of paint down. Now in those areas where there is shadow, you can use a gray or you can mix a purple for the areas like here where I see shadows. I'm gonna go, I've got a gray paint. I'm gonna go mix myself a little puddle of gray. You can use blue, you can use anything that's a cool color. Now I want to test that, see how dark it is. That's a little bit more intense maybe than I want. So I'm going to get a little blue in there, make it a little softer, maybe a little more water, and then I'm going to dab some of the water off of my brush and test it again. Okay, that looks good. Sort of a pale gray. So I'm going to come in here, just fill in those shadow shapes with a little bit of gray paint. So again, I can come back and make these more intense as I go through my painting, but right now I just want to focus on just finding that form with the first layer of shadow. So also I've got a shadow on the side of my paint tube, and it's a little bit uneven where that paint tube is kind of squished in a little bit. And it's got a little bit of shadow up here, and then it's got a shadow on the top and under the cap and on the side of the cap here. So you want to think back to your Drawing 1 class. You've got form shadows and cast shadows on these objects. So I've got to think about that cast shadow. Now, I want to make sure that the surface of this yellow ground is fairly dry at this point. So I'm going to use the back of my knuckle and just touch it. And if it feels dry, if it feels cold, it's still wet. So I think I'm dry enough now to work into that area. So I might go pick up a little bit of if you've got any violet or purple on your palette, I might pick up a little bit of that and mix it into my gray. Or you could just use gray. And I'm going to come down here and paint my first pass at the cast shadow on the surface of the table. So I've got a shadow on this side. I've also got a shadow on the top side, but it's not quite as dark. So I'm going to lighten up and maybe add a little bit of yellow into that mix because that shadow is much lighter. So I'm going to see more of the color of that paper where that shadow is less intense. And y'all remember from your drawing classes that the shadow is a cast shadow is always most intense and darkest where it's closest to the object that you're painting. Now I can see here that my light has changed a little bit too. So the shape of that shadow has changed. So I'm just going to adjust the shape of my shadow. As the light has come in differently through the window, it's changed the way that shadow looks. Now I want to intensify the blue on the stripe here as it comes across. The light is coming from up above, so it's lighter up here, and then as it comes down it's going to get darker as it comes down towards that cast shadow. So I'm going to go back with my original blue up here, and I might add a little bit of my black into that blue to make it a little bit darker and more intense. And then down on this side of the tube, it's just going to get a little bit darker. Okay. Then I might use some of that same dark blue on the underside of the cap to make that shadow a little more intense. And then up here, where I want that edge to be a little softer, I can take my brush and I can dry it off on a piece of paper towel, and I can sort of pull some of that color up and soften that edge a little bit. Now you can see that puddle, oops, is pretty intense right here. So I can take, if I don't want that puddle to be quite that dark, where that paint is puddling up at the bottom, I can take my piece of paper towel, a little shred of paper towel, and I can twist the end of it, and I can just put the end of it right into that puddle, and it will drink up some of that very, very intense color, right? So I don't get that really, really dark blue that's darker than what I want. So I'm going to go back with my gray, and I'm going to start to find places in, I'll put my paper towel here where you can see it, find some places in here where that shadow is more intense. So I've got my darker gray, and so where that fold is on the bottom of the tube, I'm going to make that shadow just a little bit darker. And here. So with watercolor, a lot of what you do is work in stages, where you let one layer or one coat of paint start to dry before you come back with the next layer of paint. It's like any kind of painting. It takes patience, but it can be really fun and really rewarding. So I want to deepen those shadows in a couple of places. Across the surface, and really I'm just looking at, I'm observing what I see in front of me and finding shapes of the shadow, right? If you just break that light and shadow down to shapes, it's not so scary. Right? If you just break it down to light and shadow. I'm going to come back with a little bit of those ridges on the cap. Now I feel like my cast shadow underneath the front side of that tube of paint needs to be a little bit darker. So I'm going to come back to my purple and my gray. And again, just like in the beginning when I was trying to get the deepest value, I've got a little bit of water on my brush, and I'm really going to scrub it around on that paint to activate it a little bit. I'm going to test it. Yeah, that's pretty dark. I may go with a little more of the purple. There. So I want to look at where it's darkest. So I see that it's darkest right down here and right under here on the back. So I'm going to start down at the bottom where I see it really dark, right up against the edge of that paint tube. And then as I see it coming up to the center here, it gets a little bit lighter. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to have that same mix, but I'm going to go back with a little bit of my yellow ochre, and I'm going to put a little bit of yellow into that shadow, just so it changes it a little bit. It makes it not quite so intense. And then where I want to soften that edge a little bit, I'm going to rinse my brush in the water, and I'm going to take my clean brush and I'm just going to kind of blur the edge of that shadow a little bit. Because y'all remember, as shadows move away from the object, they get a little blurry. Okay, and then I can see a little bit of a reflection of the blue in the shadow. In that cast shadow, it's picking up a little bit of the blue of the tube of paint. So I'm going to drop a little bit of that blue in there. And there's a little bit of blue along the top of the shadow here. Then again, I'm going to rinse my brush and soften the edge of that shadow a little bit. And then it gets dark again down at the bottom. Now I also see on the bottom side where this the tube is folded over, I've left some of it white, but I really think that whole plane is in a little bit of shadow. So I'm going to get some of my shadow value, but I want it to be really pretty light. I can come back and make it a little bit darker, but I want to go not quite so dramatic at first. It's dark across the bottom here. Go a little darker. And then I'll come back again and add a little bit more detail into that shadow, right? I'm going to wait a few minutes, let the color soften up a little bit. And then where I've got the writing on here, I can go back with my pencil and kind of give myself a guideline of where I want the letters to be. Now, I'm not really concerned with, I'm going to pick which red I want to use, and I think number 17 right here is going to be my best choice. Now my mixing wells have gotten a little bit dirty, so I'm going to take my damp paper towel and just wipe out one of those mixing wells. There we go. So I'm not super worried about my penmanship. I just want to kind of get the idea that there's writing on the side of the tube, right? So I'm going to let it just be kind of general like that, right? Not super worried about it. I don't care if you can read what that name is. And then I'll come back with some of this dark, and I'll kind of indicate some writing and letters underneath. Got a little bit of writing up here. I'm really just wanting the idea of the fact that there is a label on there. Okay. So that kind of has me to a good stopping point on my watercolor painting of my tube of paint. Pretty simple. I haven't used many colors. I used the blue, the black, the yellow, a little bit of purple, and the red. And you just have to be patient. Remember, when you're working with that first layer of paint, you want to make sure it's dry before you come back over the top of it. Okay, and we'll continue to talk about these watercolor skills as we continue to work on our urban sketches. But your first watercolor assignment is going to be 2 small watercolor paintings like this that will be due next Tuesday. Pick simple objects with not a lot of color, and have fun with it.